evening and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer, and we continue tonight with our series of interviews with some of the world's most prominent freedom fighters. Tonight, once again, we have with us Walid Shoebat. Walid, of course, is the famous ex-Palestinian terrorist who at one time thought that it was the best thing in life to murder Jews and to further the jihad cause. And then, like the man who was turned into a newt in the Monty Python movie, he got better. And so Walid Shoebat, having gotten better, is with us here tonight, and we are going to discuss Islam and the Middle East, the past, now, and beyond. Now, what this is about really is what the Middle East used to be like and how it has been transformed by the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was, of course, widely hailed as a positive development, as a glorious outpouring of freedom and democracy in the Middle East at the time that it began in January 2011. And I and a few others were among the few who thought that maybe it wasn't quite as wonderful as everybody was making it out to be. And so, Walid, perhaps you could sketch out what it was that people were hoping for and why their hopes were ultimately empty and futile.
Well, many in the West believed that the Islamic movement could be moderated via what they call, Islamic democracy. I know Daniel Pipes, he's a conservative who believes that we can have Islamic democracy, but it is futile because saying Islamic democracy is like saying capitalistic communism. We're going to basically moderate communism by introducing communistic capitalism. So it just doesn't work. And so the high hopes by many of the think tank in the West believed that they can introduce different models of Islam. And they began to categorize Islam into different models. You had Abbasid Islam, Rashidiyun Islam, you had Sufi Islam, which they believe, by the way, is peaceful Islam, but it's not. And there's all sorts of Islams that they can introduce. But as we began to see the Arab Spring, and we began to see on the horizon, and now even in Syria, people are beginning to realize that this small group in the West, vis-a-vis people like myself, like you, like Wafa Sultan, like others, even secularists, not even Christian, who really defined Islam as what it is. It's a system that has much in its edicts, and it's in the Quran, or it's in a prophetic view where Muhammad says, first Constantinople, then Rome. So they began to see the movement in the Arab Spring, becoming an Islamic winter. We've seen the elections in Egypt with Muhammad Morsi, an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood. We see a Nahda in Tunisia. We see even heart plucking as of late, just this last couple days. This incidents in Syria, people are beginning to see that what we've been saying about the Free Syrian Army is that it is an Islamist Al-Qaeda connected terror organization. So people are beginning to realize the facts on the ground, and the denial by much of the media is coming much weaker as an argument today.
So what do you think happened in Washington, Walid? Why did they so spectacularly misinterpret what was going on in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya at the time? Why did Obama even warmly support the Islamic supremacist Muslim Brotherhood revolution in Egypt and even give military aid to the jihadist takeover in Libya?
Well, your question has two prongs. We must put Obama on a separate prong, on a fork of this road of the White House and its policies, with another prong, which is the liberal that is ruling in this country. The liberal, many in the right, in the middle, believe that the liberal is naive and he is the useful idiot. But I don't agree with that notion, because I think much of the liberal movement in America are very educated. It's not an issue of education here. Because in the liberal movement, if you track, let's say, Al Gore, and you look at Al Gore's statements in which he compliments Islam, he really hates and has disdain for Christianity, the Judeo-Christian ethics. He is very much paganistic in his views and his outlook from his spiritual perspective. So he really truly has a war with Judeo-Christian ethics. He is an environmentalist. When I track his statements about Islam and environmentalism, one time I began to trace where does he get his views about Islam. I traced them to Abdullah Omar Nassif, who was one of the to Abdullah Omar Nassif, who was one of the godfathers of Al-Qaeda. He was the boss of Huma Abedin and
Wait a minute, let's just make sure, because the sound wasn't all that tremendous there, Walid, and I just want to make sure that everybody caught that. You said to one of the founders of Al-Qaeda?
He's one of the godfathers of Al-Qaeda. He
okay, and one of the godfathers of Al-Qaeda is responsible for some of the major elements of the thought of
Islam and environmentalism. Islam and environmentalism.
And Al Gore has picked up a lot of these same ideas.
Exactly. In fact, I quote, I give quotes, give the statements. They very much parallel the same statements coming from Abdullah Omar Nassif, who was a spokesperson at many of these events of Islam and environmentalism. So in essence, what you find is that there is much of an agreement between the liberal movement in the West and the Islamist movement. So when Islam speaks about what they title as himas, hima is environmental protectorates, when you can hunt, when you can't hunt in Islam, and so on and so forth. And so they pick up on Islam and environmentalism, how even animals are equal to human at some points in Islam, in which Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, complimented the animal world. You know, these things tickles the ears of the environmentalist. Islam, in the misconception by the West, believing that Islam is conservative. In fact, if you look at American media or Western media, when they address Saudi Arabia, they address it as extremely conservative. But this is a false notion, because you can't say that environmentalism fits in under the umbrella of Western conservatism. Western conservatism is very unique. It stems from Judeo-Christian ethics and culture. So from that perspective, you know, the environmental movement complements Islam. You look at the idea of the Big Bang. The Big Bang theory is very much complemented by the Muslims. You have Islamic think tank that says that the Big Bang came from the Quran. There's a verse in the Quran that talks about the Big Bang and how Allah basically created the Big Bang. So Islam really is evolution. They believe in creative evolution of some sort. Then you have al-ishtirakiyya al-islamiyya, Islamic socialism, where in Libya and in Egypt, even under Muammar Gaddafi or under Sadat or Hosni Mubarak, there was some sort of a socialist structure in the government in which it tickles the ears of a socialist government in the West. This is why you see Jimmy Carter in the past. He didn't do anything when the revolution in Iran happened, because liberalism in the West, in its core, is very revolutionary. Obama is very revolutionary. Hope and change, spreading the wealth. In fact, they use the stories of when Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina in Al-Hijrah, and the Al-Muhajirun and the Ansar spread the wealth, so on and so forth. This is why you don't find Keith Ellison being a conservative. He's very liberal. So, you know, it is time to thwart, to thrash this idea that Islam and Western-style conservatism really go hand in hand. They don't. They're really at opposite sides. And this is why, as you eloquently have stated in much of your writings, when you talked about how the Muslim Brotherhood stated that they will use the elements in the West that propagates their views. I'm paraphrasing the exact quotations from the Muslim Brotherhood manual. I'm sure you can comment on that.
Well, yeah, but Walid, there's some other things that you say that are very provocative, interesting, that I wanted to ask you about. For one thing, that when you say that we've got to get rid of the idea that that there's anything conservative about Islam, you're absolutely right that the mainstream media routinely refers to a place like Saudi Arabia as the conservative Islamic kingdom, and people generally think of Islam as a conservative thing because of the morality aspect and the moral critique that Islamic jihadis always level against the West. And they say that Western women dress immodestly and look like prostitutes and so on, whereas their women cover up and are modest and so on. And that a lot of Western conservatives find this appealing because they are appalled by the licentiousness and increasing amorality of Western society. And so they think that they have some sort of an ally in the Muslims who make this kind of moral critique. Now, is there really a convergence between Western Judeo-Christian morality and Islamic morality?
That's another very important issue you bring. When it comes to the ethics codes of law, the moral code of law of the West is thou shalt not kill with a big, huge period. You know, you can't kill someone who differs with you or somebody who's of a different view than you. Where in the Islamic structure, thou shalt not kill a Muslim. So when you look at extremely liberal, or you look at the anarchists, or you look at communism, you look at much of the debased liberal movement that happened in the West in the past, it's not thou shalt not kill, it's thou shalt not kill a communist, or thou shalt not kill a Nazi, or thou shalt not kill, you see, so from the ethical view, Islam is still liberal because they harbor a code of law that basically allows a certain group to have rights over another certain group, where the judicial laws in Islam, you know, if a Muslim kills a non-Muslim, it's not a death penalty. Only if a Muslim kills a Muslim is a death penalty. So if we compare those ethics, we can find much of those ethics in Nazism, communism, and other isms, but we don't find it in the Judeo-Christian ethics. Under the Judeo-Christian ethics, there is, in fact, there is equality under two circumstances only. It's a myth to say we cry for equality, period. No, it's equality under the law and equality of opportunity. That equality doesn't exist from an Islamic view. There is no equality under Sharia. Equality only pertains to a Muslim. He is equal to another Muslim, but a non-Muslim is not equal to a Muslim. This is why in the ethics of inheritance in Islam, a woman inherits half the man. Her testimony is the testimony of half a man. A dhimmi is not equal to a Muslim. So if we look at it from every aspect of the ethics of Islam and Sharia, it's very much is in line with the revolutionary mentality of the atheists, the liberals, the anarchists, and the communists, and the socialists. So this is why we have to look at the reality on the ground of how Islam is being carried out once Islam dominates a country. It's out with the Christians, it's out with the women's rights, it's out with... So even if you look at the dress code of Islam isn't a Judeo-Christian ethic. Because even if you look historically, you know, in Judeo-Christian ethic, women go to church or women go to synagogue, they can cover their hair, but never the face, the hijab. That's something in biblical times was considered for prostitutes. You know, you don't cover your face. A woman's face is her beauty. A woman's hair is her beauty. She covers her hair in church, so on and so forth. So even if you look at these aspects, they are very much foreign to a Judeo-Christian heritage that is rich in the West, that was rich in the West. Unfortunately, those things are dissipating in the West.
Yeah, and they're dissipating in the West at a time when the aggressive Islamic view of morality is becoming more and more prevalent and more accepted. Now, another thing that people often complain about or scratch their heads about in puzzlement is that Western feminists who have been arrayed for so long against the supposed subjugation of women in the Christian society and the Western scheme of things don't seem to have anything to say to the oppression of women in Islam. And I've actually written many articles myself about this phenomenon and about Western feminist writers running interference and making apologies for and defending the oppression of women in Islam. Now, this would seem to correspond with what you're saying, would it not? That there's some deeper correspondence between leftist thought and Islamic thought that is larger than the issues that feminists treat in the West today. Is that correct?
You're absolutely right. We have to understand myth number one is easily busted, that it's about women's lib movement is about women's rights, or even PETA, which is supposed to be for animal movement, is about animals. It's not, because if you look at PETA, they complain when a Palestinian uses a donkey and packs it with explosives and kills Jews in Israel. They don't complain about the terrorism aspect. They complain about the donkey aspect. So, because a donkey is equal to human. When it comes to the women's lib, it's women's lib to abortion, not women's lib basically to free them from slavery, as what we see happening in the Islamic world. When it comes to the women's issue, I've always asked, if it's about women's rights, what are they doing about Islam in Iran, or Islam in the Sunni sect, in which in Iran they have pleasure marriage, which uses women as prostitutes, really. And if we think that the Sunni Muslim world condemns this because this is only something the Rawafid or a Shia does, it's something is also in the Sunni. They have misyar marriage. In fact, you can go to misyar online and you can find these kind of deals in which men can bring so-called wives to their hotel rooms, and as long as they pay the dowry and so on and so forth. So from that aspect, from the moral code aspect, we in the Judeo-Christian culture call this prostitution. Although the liberal would love to legalize prostitution, yet Islam legalizes prostitution, same way as the liberal want to legalize prostitution. So even from the ethics perspective, they are much in collision. They are much in agreement with the liberal movement. And nobody is talking about misyar marriages. By the way, this is not something that is such a small issue, because it's been sanctioned by Sharia from both the government of Egypt as well as the Saudi Arabian government. So this has been made sanctioned and legalized with the Sunni sect of misyar marriage. It exists it exists everywhere.
Walid, yeah, actually, I just saw recently, I think yesterday, a story about Shiites in the UK increasingly practicing pleasure marriage. Maybe I think that it would be wise at this point for us to back up just a second, and if you could possibly explain the concept of pleasure marriage and misyar marriage for people who are not familiar with them.
Yes, very well. Pleasure marriage, or nikah mut'ah, is a Shiite sanctioned temporal marriage, in which it could be a marriage between a Muslim male and a Muslim female for a month, for a week, for a day, for 1 hour, in which sexual intercourse happens. And it is a testimony, it is basically an agreement between the two, with Allah as a witness, basically, which the Sunnis basically criticize, because this is not, doesn't adhere to Sharia law, in which you have to have witnesses to the marriage, in which you have to have dowry. Of course, the mut'ah marriage has a dowry. Basically, it's a payment for prostitution. But the Sunni sect criticizes the Shia, and so they came up with what is called misyar marriage. Misyar literally means the traveler's marriage, the easement marriage, the easy marriage. When you're traveling, I'm sure, Robert, you travel, and your wife is not, your wife
Walid,
is not,
I don't believe in any of these things. Let's just make that clear, but go ahead.
I'm just being sarcastic here.
Neither believe in nor practice, but go ahead.
Right, to the disgust of this, that a man doesn't have his wife in Saudi Arabia, or even in the United States of America. They even have, links on these websites that you can get a call misyar marriage on the comfort of your hotel room. Of course, I
watch a baseball game on ESPN myself, but anyway, go ahead.
Right, of course. And the wife will appear at the hotel, and of course they will have two witnesses. And of course it's not a pimp; it is a conduit, a broker, who will basically present the two witnesses. They will sign the nikah document, the marriage document, and the marriage commences for as long as the two desire, based on an agreement of the price for the dowry. Even the term nikah itself, the term marriage Islam uses, is not the same as a Western concept. Nikah is a term that is used about fertility, fertilizing. It's very demeaning. So when I came to the West and I saw how the West has conducted their weddings for sickness or for health, for better or for worse, that a husband and a wife are friends, and they're friends forever, and they're partners forever. And I looked at the Judeo-Christian ethics, man to one woman, and that's it, and it has great respect for women. So there is much difference between the relationship between husband and wife. In Islam, I'm sure you're familiar with, the Quran says, Nisa'ukum hirthun lakum. Hirth is a term you use for mowing the field, plowing the field. So your wives are your plow fields. And I'm sure you can figure out what the plow is. And of course, in the Quran and in Islam, it's the seed from the man. There's no seed of the woman. When I first read the Bible, I was shocked in Genesis, the seed of the woman. That took me a month just to look at that verse, the seed of the woman, that there is two seeds here, that there is two elements here that create, that is part of the creation process to create the zygote and the fetus. That doesn't exist anywhere in Islam. This is why in Islam, even if a divorce happens, the husband gets the child. That's his seed.
Well, wait a minute, Walid. Walid, hold up just a second. I got to ask you this. I didn't grow up in a Muslim country. I've been to Muslim countries, but I didn't study biology there. But surely they teach in school that genetically the child is 50-50, the child of the mother and of the father, no?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure, and the Muslims know that.
Well, then how is this understood in light of the Quran, or does the Quran just trump it?
Well, absolutely. The Quran, basically trumps the science. Of course, they agree with the science. The Muslim knows that scientifically this is absurd. Even if you look at the creation, when the mudgha, or the congealed blood, that human is becomes a congealed blood, because they believed that once a woman is pregnant, she has a period, but her period stops because the blood gets congealed, and so on and so forth. This comes from ancient Greece. Yet they still try to palletize that interpretation to say that the mudgha and the leech issue similarly looks like the scientific zygote and things of that sort. So they play the word games. And if you look at the Quran itself, there's much play on the word games in trying to change what the word means to something else. Islam and science really collide. But it's very funny that the Muslims use the Quran under the umbrella of science.
Indeed, indeed. I've seen some really absurd attempts to show that the Quran is not only scientifically, scientifically accurate, but that it was scientifically prophetic. And there's an Islamic apologist and a widely reputed moderate, or so-called moderate, in Turkey, whom I'm sure you've heard of, Harun Yahya,
yes,
or Adnan Akhtar. And he argues that there is a passage in the Quran which prophesies the splitting of the moon, and he says, oh, that refers to the landing of the man on the moon. And the Quran foresaw all that, because when the men landed on the moon, they took soil and brought it back to earth, and that means that they split the moon.
Right.
And he actually offers this as serious analysis and evidence that the Quran is a miraculous book.
But it was part of my journey, Robert, when I first the Bible, because I was crazy about Mustafa Mahmoud. He's a Muslim scholar from Egypt, and I read all his books when I was in my teenage life in Israel. And he makes several arguments about the Quran and science. there is a verse in the Quran that says, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. We've created all living things out of water. That all living creatures have water in it. This is not something that Muhammad did know. However, when I began to examine the book of Job, it talked about many of these aspects. All living things were of water. And it's in the Bible. The same thing with the creation. فَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمُضْغَةِ عِظَامًا لَحْمًا, and all I forgot the exact verses, but that Allah had created man from basically
Clots of blood.
Yes, but then he created the bones and he clothed the bones with flesh. But it doesn't state what Job states, that after the bones there was built the sinews of the body, which is the nerve system. It's not just flesh. It gives you the issue of sinews, that there is sinews, which is much more in depth than the Quran, which means very easily that the Quran or Islam could have easily borrowed some of these verses from the Bible. So to say that Islam discovered some scientific information about creation is absolutely debunked at this point, because you find a lot of these things and much more eloquently written in the Bible. And this is why when I first began to write, why I changed to becoming a Christian, I began to write about my findings from the Bible itself, thwarting all the arguments that the so-called Islam and science tries to make.
Well, that's really fascinating because, perhaps we can discuss this a bit more after the break. I remember very early on when I first started reading the Quran and studying Islam. This is 1981, 1981, 82, and I was having lunch regularly with a Palestinian Muslim who was an exchange student at the college. And he, when I would discuss Islam and Christianity and the Quran in depth and everything that I said, I know now that he was repeating standard Quranic understandings and standard Islamic responses to Christian perspectives and Christian ways of thinking. And he seemed absolutely, of course, I didn't know anything at the time, and so I wasn't able to come back further. But it would be fascinating, I think, and perhaps we could get back to it after the break, if we explored a little bit of how you must have had the same kind of mindset, because the Quran contains so much that's sort of a response to Christianity, not to authentic Christianity, but to Christianity as it's pictured in Islam, and such that a lot of Muslims think, well, they know all about Christianity, and it's not worth investigating. And so it's interesting. It would be interesting to hear how it is that you got beyond that way of thinking into thinking maybe there was something beyond that that was not what you'd been told. In any case, we are here with Walid Shoebat. This is ABN's Jihad Watch program, and we will be right back after these important messages.
The word gospel translates to news that brings joy. But this isn't just any news. A gospel is news that changes a life forever. After being invaded and enslaved by Persia, Greece won 2 decisive battles at Marathon and Solnus. The Greeks sent out heralds, also called evangelists, to proclaim the good news to the cities. We have fought for you. We have won. And now you're no longer slaves. You're free. The reality is that we are all slaves, slaves to sin and slaves to death. We are slaves in need of good news. Enter Jesus, God's Son, fully God, fully man, bringing news that would change our lives forever. His news was this: I am the divine, come to you to do what you could not do for yourself. I will take what you deserve so you can have what I deserve. You have no idea how much it will cost me, but you also cannot imagine the depths of my love for you. It is a gift that I give freely. So repent. Repent from all the ways you've run from me and follow me. Follow me because I am the only way to eternal life. Follow me because I'm the Savior you've been looking for. Follow me because I have authority over everything, yet I have humbled myself for you. Follow me because I died on a cross for you, because I'm your true love. and your true life. This is my good news for you. This is my gospel, that you have been saved by grace and that you are slaves no more.
Good evening and welcome back to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer, and we are here tonight with one of the nation's foremost freedom fighters, Walid Shoebat. And our stated topic tonight was Islam in the Middle East. But as often happens on these wild and woolly evenings, we've gotten a bit far afield, and that's what makes it all the more fun. And so, we have been discussing some bits of Walid's own personal journey, and it reminded me of some conversations I had many, many hundreds of years ago, actually specifically about 30 years ago, 32 or 3 years ago, with a Muslim I knew at the time. And we were discussing how Islam contains, or the Quran particularly, contains enough of, excuse me, enough of an inoculation, so to speak, against Christianity that it keeps people from considering the real thing. I can give you an example. I remember, Walid, I was speaking with this gentleman whose name was Mahmoud, and I said to him, you know, there's a closeness to God in the Christian tradition. We call God our Father, and we think of God as our Father, and there's nothing like that in Islam. And he said, you call God your Father? Then why does he punish you for your sins? And he sat back and folded his arms, and he looked very pleased with himself. And I had no idea what was going on. It wasn't until not long after that I read Quran chapter 5, verse 18, which says, the Jews and the Christians say, we are God's children and his beloved. Then say to them, why does he punish you for your sins? And I realized, oh, wow, I just played out a Quran verse for this guy. I gave him the thing that the Jews and Christians say, and he gave me what Allah said to say back to me. And he must have been very pleased that Allah had given him the exact answer to my exact statement. And the thing is that if you were a Muslim, then how did you break out of that mindset of thinking, well, you know what the Christians are going to say, and you have all the answers, and you know they're wrong, and so how do you get from there to where you are now?
Well, like you said, everything in life is a journey, really. And the Muslims do use the Bible or have knowledge even of a lot of things in the Bible without even them reading the Bible, because Islam in its essence have borrowed a lot of things in the Bible, even scientific things. That when the Bible is not about science, it's not a document about science. However, if God says something that is about nature or about creation or about the essence of the world or about us as human beings, it is also has to be scientifically accurate. But what the Muslims do, Robert, since we're talking about Islam and the claim of science in the Quran, is that they exaggerate things. It's sort of like, you know, your child is, you know, writing a little scribble, and he talks about how he made a kite and he flew a kite. And so that becomes all of a sudden holy writ to you, and you say, well, a kite is a flying object. And since a kite is a flying object, my son discovered airplane, you know, assuming there's no airplanes. It's the same thing in the Quran. You know, they make these claims from minuscule statements or a word that doesn't even say anything. Just like you saying, I played Frisbee with my kid. Since a Frisbee is a flying saucer, we were really experimenting and we were making and manufacturing a flying saucer. So they exaggerate this kind of thing. So you find tons of these things on the creation of man and on the earth. And in fact, when my first book I wrote online was called Dear Muslim, Let Me Tell You Why I Believe, I can even give you examples of my findings in that testimony. Let's give an example here in the Quran, in Surah Al-Alaq, which means the congealed blood, really. It says, we created man out of a blood clot. Of course, we know scientifically that this is false. So like Dr. Bukel says that the Quran verse is a major scientific discovery at that time. But the evidence is, how can this be true? Blood is not a zygote. Blood is blood. So they twist the word from alaqa to ulayqa. Ulayqa is a leech-like thing. So since when the fetus first, the embryo, when it first starts, it looks like a leech, then they get these photos of a leech versus the zygote, you know, in its first stages, and they compare the photos, and they trick the eye of the Muslim to say, hey, look, the Quran talks about, impregnation and all these things, but it doesn't, because congealed blood is all congealed blood, and you find much interpretation from the time of Islam that it talks about it being literally congealed blood. Also on the fingerprint, does man think in the Quran, in Surah Al-Qiyamah 75 verses 3 to 4, does man think that we cannot assemble his bones? Nay, we are able to put together in perfect order his very fingertips. Well, wait a minute. Since fingertips have thumbprints and fingerprints, oh, it's talking about fingerprints. And since me and you don't have the same fingerprints, Islam is also talking about the discovery that we all are different and we all have fingerprints and we all get prosecuted if our fingerprints at a crime scene. All these things are extrapolated from simply the word fingertips. But there's nothing about the imprint of the finger in the Quran at all. You find the same thing in the issues of biology. The parable of those who take protectors other than Allah, is that a spider who builds a house, but truly the flimsiest of houses is the spider house. And then, I believe Mustafa Mahmoud was arguing to say that the spider web really can be a very strong web. I can't remember exactly what his argument is, that the Quran basically made a miraculous discovery about the spider web and so on and so forth. But the verse comes from, I believe in the book of Job, Ayub, in chapter 7, verses 13 to 15, talking about the flimsiness of the spider web. So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hope of the hypocrite shall perish, whose confidence shall be cut off, and whose trust is a spider web. That seems to be barred from the Bible, and the Bible is not making a scientific claim there. On earth and geology, you find in the Quran, we ask thee concerning the mountains, say, my Lord will uproot them and scatter them as dust. What is that? Is that a scientific discovery, Robert? And they go on with making some things about geology. It's not even related to the subject at all.
So Walid, how did you move from one to the other? How did you start to realize that this was hokum?
It was because I have studied Mustafa Mahmoud's works and kind of memorized them inside out during my youth. And when I first began to read the Bible, when my wife told me She said she was Catholic, and she said, you know, you said that the Bible has been corrupted. It has nothing miraculous in it. Perhaps you can find me the corruptions, and if you do, I will become a Muslim. So as a Muslim typical male, I told myself, praise Allah, I will find the problems in the Bible. I purchased a Bible for $10, a King James Bible, New King James, and I began to read from Genesis, and by the time I reached Job, it was over. I purchased a search engine of the Bible and began to ask myself if indeed the Bible is not superior like I think. I began to ask the honest question. I must find superior science in the Quran than the Bible. When I began to compare what I believed was scientific miracles in the Quran, I began to find in the book of Job, in the book of Genesis and other books, in Isaiah as well regarding the circle of the earth, I began to find that what the Bible is truly giving factual scientific evidence, like when God sits on the circle of the earth. In the Quran, it says, وَالْأَرْضُ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَّاهَا. وَالْأَرْضُ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَّاهَا. And the earth after that, he basically made it straight. It made it flat. The verse was talking about the flatness of the earth in the Quran. So the Mustafa Mahmoud began to play the game. I began to understand the games. Dahaha, to make it straight, the word duhiyya, which means an egg shape of some form, seems to be circle. So they transformed a verse that was scientifically inaccurate to make it a scientific miracle in the Quran from the word duhiyya, which is a shape of an egg. And because the North Pole is narrower than the South Pole, wow, it is the shape of an egg of some sort. Nobody would know that except the Hubble telescope and so on and so forth. So the Quran had a scientific miracle. But these things were very easily thwarted because the word dahaha is easily been interpreted in the Arabic language from the inception of the Quran till now. No one disagrees. It's about the flatness of the earth.
Yes. Yes, a lot of these, so many of these things. Well, just like the splitting of the moon thing, nobody would have ever said, oh, that's about the man landing on the moon, until the man landed on the moon. And then they went back and tried to find something that would show that it had been predicted in the Quran. It was all rather transparent. In any case...
yeah, but before you go, there's one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one more. You know, here's another interesting case. In the Quran, it says, وَالْأَرْضِ ذَاتِ الرَّجْعِ, which literally means that the earth returns back. You know, that, you know, sorry, I think it was سَمَاءِ ذَاتِ الرَّجْعِ, which means whatever is in the sky comes down, basically like rain. Yet, they began to conclude that this is talking about the electromagnetic waves, which basically bounces back. The sky acts as a bouncing agency of electromagnetic waves. But what I read in the Bible was fascinating, Robert. Look at the verse in the Bible of what it says about the skies. It says in the Bible, give me a second here. In the book of Job, there it is. And that is in Job chapter 37, verse 18. With him, God, have you spread out the skies strong as a cast metal mirror. Wow. It acts like a mirror in which, you know, this could be argued, much better argument for electromagnetic waves bouncing back than the sky returns as in the Quran, and there it is in the book of Job. I had tons of these findings in my first letter that I wrote. It was titled, Dear Muslim, let me tell you why I believed. And this is why, basically, I believed. One of the reasons was the scientific reasons, Quran versus the Bible. And then on a major level, it was the prophetic reasons, which, most of my writings is about.
Well, thank you very much. This is all so fascinating. And there's so many ways that we could go from this point. But I do feel rather duty-bound to return to the stated topic at least a little bit in this final portion, Islam in the Middle East. one thing we can say to tie all this together is that people who have this understanding of the miraculous nature of the Quran and the idea that it contains all the secrets of human existence and the directions and the guide for every aspect of human behavior, they have now taken political power in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and are about to do so in Syria as well. Is that correct?
That is very correct. Islam.
So can you sketch out the implications of that? What do you think this might look like in 5 years as a result of this?
Well, it's very easy. In fact, many say that the Middle East is complicated. I don't think me and you see it as complicated at all. It's easy to figure out the Middle East, looking at the future, by first looking at the past. That Islam was crushed basically when the Khilafah was dismantled. And let's not forget where the base of that crushing blow that Judeo-Christian West gave to Islamdom happened in the country of Turkey under the Ottoman Empire that was dismantled. And so that was in 1924. And in 1928, after the bruise of Islam, you had many movements in several aspects in the Islamic world, several different areas in the Islamic world. You had, in Turkey, you had Said Nursi, who was basically, I think he was assassinated by the government. And you had, after that, Adnan Mandris. And after that, you had Erbakan, who basically was the major hub to put a good foothold of the revival of Islam in Turkey. You had in the Palestinian arena Hizb ut-Tahrir, in which it exported its ideology into Great Britain. These were persecuted Islamists in their own world. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was persecuted. So these entities began to expound and find the perfect embryo for it in the West. This is why, if you look at what happened in Tunisia, you had, what's his name? I forgot his name. In Tunisia, the head of the Tunisian Islamist government now.
You mean Ghannouchi?
Ghannouchi, yes. Al-Ghannouchi, he was exiled in Great Britain. He was in exile, and you have also Qaradawi was in exile in Qatar. You had the Khomeinis were in exile in France. All these exiles flourished very well in the West. So we must understand that this attempt to revive Islamdom really used the West as a launching pad into the Middle East, and using Western democracy and freedom to begin to argue for their arguments. Hizb ut-Tahrir, of course, in India, gave birth to the Jama'ah Islami. I'm sure you know who the leader is. And so these entities began to be very active. And as the Egyptians, under Anwar Sadat, even Hosni Mubarak, persecuted the Islamists, they went to Saudi Arabia, began to work with the Wahhabist movement, and saw as a major time when Saddam Hussein basically was destroyed, and basically the breakup of the Soviet Union, building a great crevice in the area, and they began to wanting to fill it. We have the same problems in the Caucasus. Saudi Arabia with Wahhabism began to export its ideology into Chechnya. What we see in Boston bombing, we got to blame the Saudis for it, not just the Chechnyans. So they began to export that ideology all over the place, and the revolution began to succeed when Barack Obama took power in the United States of America, made his famous speech in Egypt, in which basically he insisted that the Muslim Brotherhood be present at his speech when it was considered an outlawed organization in Egypt. So it was the West basically that began to allow this to ferment. We see the same situation in Syria, the FSA being supported by the West. You have a Qatar, Saudi, Turkish base aiding and abetting those revolutionaries in Syria. And so this became the prime green light, if you will, when the West opened the gates and stopped trying to stop the spread of Islamism. The same thing happened in Turkey when the Ergenekon fiasco happened, in which judges were being imprisoned, political dissidents journalists were imprisoned, judges. It used to be under the control of the Turkish generals, in which when Erbakan arose to power, they thwarted the Islamist movement. They dismembered the Islamic parliament under the Erdogan Khan. After the Erdogan Khan, Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, began to make legal the establishment of political entities, even if they are Islamist. So it happened in Turkey. It happened, we don't focus much on Turkey. We focus on Egypt. We focus on Iran. So the West, with its basically naivete in not understanding that it's not the cyber rattling Iran that's the problem. It is a problem. It's a major problem. But the arising Sunni crescent, if you will. So if we look at historically of recent history, what happened? We had the military power peg in the Middle East was Iraq. Iraq, you know, the wings of the strength of Iraq were plucked. This is the ancient Babylonian kingdom, if you will, which basically thwarted Iran's expansions. That was plucked by the West, and that gave credence to Iran to rise as a mini superpower in the region, in which we had to try to thwart it by aiding and abetting the Sunni sect of Islam, which comprises 85% of Muslims, which is the most dangerous beast in the region than even in Iran. So now what's happened is the Arab Spring is turning to an Islamist winter. We know how the future is going to work out if and when the last bone of contention, that is Syria, falls under the power peg of the Sunni sect of Islam, with the collaboration of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, as well as the West. Then the Islamist movement of the Sunni sect will begin to build that crescent in Syria. Turkey will be right next door. We have the situation also in Iraq. We are pulled out of Iraq, undermining the issue of the Mosul, the Kurdish district, in which it has the power of the the oil wealth of Iraq has not been equally distributed between Shia Sunni versus the Kurds, the Kurdish area. So this becomes another major problem in the region, Kurdistan, that's going to be arising, I think, soon. And so, you know, what we're seeing is a rise of a Sunni sect, but the West is being fooled to think that what Egypt wants and what Tunisia wants is what they call the Turkish model of Islam. Yet the West is also beginning to realize that perhaps not allowing Turkey entry into the European Union was a wise decision, because as we see happening, Turkey is turning neo-Ottoman, regardless to how much they're trying to deny it. They interfere into the situation in Bahrain. Any problem happens in the Middle East, there's Turkey. They're interfering into Syria. They're interfering in Bahrain with the Shia fiasco there in Bahrain. So this whole propaganda by the Turkish regime, by Davutoglu, who says zero conflict, is not true. They are interfering in every conflict. They're interfering when Israel tries to explore gas in the Mediterranean. There you find the Turkish ships. There you find Turkey forcing Israel to basically bow down to the Turkish government, giving it the confidence level in the Muslim world to say, hey, we are the representation of the Sunni Muslim world. We have basically arisen over the power of Iran. We can thwart Iran. We can neutralize Iran. We can friend Iran. We can politically even interfere in the issues of the nuclear issues. In fact, Erdogan interfered when there was an issues with attacking Iran to destroy its nuclear facilities. Iran was experimenting with tritium, beryllium agencies, chemical agents that are used only to explode bombs, not to basically make nuclear facilities for civilian use. So this is what is happening. We've created that vacuum in by the West. We have plucked a major power. We have aided the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Russians. That created the Taliban. We have aided the Arab Spring and created the Muslim Sunni sect currently. So what we're going to see in the near future is a desire by the West to moderate Islam, and the Islamic movement and their slick willies are very keen to this. They will bring those arguments to say, we are going under the model of Islamic democracy. This is why I think Daniel Pipes isn't working for the right cause when he tries to say Islam can be moderated. It is not going to work. He's going to be proven wrong. Me and you and the others were right the whole time. So that, in my view, there is no hope of return currently in the Middle East, because what we're doing is we are thrashing away the essence of nationalism in the Middle East. Under nationalism, even under Saddam Hussein, Christian minorities had rights. Even in Syria right now, Christians have rights. The treatment of Christians is very well in Syria. In Egypt, under Hosni Mubarak, it wasn't that great, but it sure is much worse now.
Well, yes, no doubt about that. Arab nationalism, as a matter of fact, excuse me, was largely founded by Christian Arabs. Michel Aflaq, notably, on the hope that by constructing a political philosophy that was secular and based on ethnic identity, the Christian Arabs would be able to get out from under the institutionalized discrimination and harassment of dhimmitude, the second-class status mandated for them under Islamic law. And so it was consciously constructed in order to allow Christians to have a better life in Muslim countries. And that was largely the case in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and even now in Assad's Syria, and in the other Arab nationalist states, certainly in the Egypt of Gamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar Sadat, and Hosni Mubarak. But all this is now rapidly changing. Arab nationalism is essentially dead as a political philosophy, and the Islamic supremacists are on the rise. And so we just have a few minutes left, Walid, but how do you see all this shaking out in the near future?
Well, as we see Arab nationalism erode, in fact, I think we had a debate, me and you and Anjum Chaudhry, and as soon as I said, you know, what Islam wants is the destruction of nationalism and creating a universalist state, and he immediately jumped right on it. It's exactly the problem. We're going to see the more of erosion of nationalism, and what we're going to see is the persecution of Christians in heavy fashion in the countries of Egypt. So what we're going to see, how it's going to shake up, is that as Turkey tries with its new Ottoman policy, tries to bring in the tentacles of what used to be the ancient Ottoman world together, I believe it will fail to bring them under one entity. I think they will continue to be their own entities. You know, North Africa, you know, Tunisia will be Tunisia, Libya will be Libya. They might unite as a northern alliance of North Africa in the future. And also, let's not forget the Balkans. Let's not forget the southern states of Russia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. There's much work between the Turkish government and those states in exporting and importing gas lines and so on and so forth. So what's going to happen is that I think Turkey will thrive in the near future from an industrial perspective, in which it becomes the beacon of the Muslim world, of the Sunni Muslim world. Iran, I think the West is hoping that they will pit Sunni versus Shia. That's what I think the policy is. If you pit Iran against the Sunnis, eventually the Shiite will lose. But I think that's a false analogy, because we have seen even in the Israeli Hezbollah fiasco, Hamas jumped right in, carried the flags of Hezbollah, Hezbollah carried the flags of Hamas. So there was a unity, but it will be a temporal unity in which Iran will try to bring both Shia and Sunni together in the future under the banner of Neo-Ottomanism. So I think within the next 10 years, that's what we're going to be seeing. In fact, Brother Robert, 15 years ago, I talked about Neo-Ottomanism. You couldn't find a single hit in Google. I said, what we're going to see the next, 2 decades is the rise of Neo-Ottomanism. Everybody was laughing at me. Now you go to Google and put Neo-Ottomanism, there isn't a single expert who's an honest expert who would disagree that that's the image that is reflected into the future of the entire region. Absolutely. So, in other words, the Ottoman Empire got bruised, and it's rising, and its bruise is being healed. And basically, if I may bring some biblical essence to this, much of these things have been predicted in the Bible. In fact, much of the older interpretation in the Bible was looking at the Ottoman Empire vis-a-vis the book of Daniel, vis-a-vis even John, when he talks about this beast with the body of a leopard. That's a the Greco part of the Roman Empire, if you will, with the feet of the bear, that's Persia, Iran, with the mouth of a lion, that is Babylonia, basically Iraq, Arabia, all these regions. That composes the threat to Christendom. You know, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, has his own sets of prophecies. He said first Constantinople, then Rome. Hello, Constantinople has been taken. Yeah. Then now I want to take Rome. And I struggle with my evangelical compatriots and say, wait a minute here. You keep putting down Rome. The Islamdom wants to engulf Rome. And
that's the foremost center of Christianity.
That's right.
That's why they want it.
That's correct. And
Walid, that's a good place to end. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been quite fascinating, but we're actually even a little over, and I much appreciate you being with us tonight and sharing your wisdom. This has been ABN's Jihad Watch program. And Walid, thanks again. Walid Shoebat, a foremost authority on Islam and an ex-Muslim himself. And I, of course, am Robert Spencer. Good night, and God bless.